Well, thank you very much for tuning in and for joining me on this broadcast for today. As I believe that wherever you are, you will be able to gain knowledge, information, and understanding. Emmanuel Nkhoma here from the African Institute of Leadership and Governance. My discussion today is on a great subject which I have done a wide and extensive survey conducting research for the past 12 years, traveling from country to country of our continent of Africa and asking citizens questions on issues of governance, on how these countries are being governed, and if democracy has worked for us. It is in my pursuit of information and knowledge that I came up with this great dissertation or this great proposal to Africa. After having traveled many African countries, I discovered that many countries are struggling in Africa on embracing democracy. They are struggling on embracing democracy, not because they do not love democracy. Just as many nations in Africa are still struggling on embracing Christianity, struggling on embracing Islam, struggling on embracing Hinduism, Shintoism, and so on and so forth. I have discovered that in my walk and my journey, I have come to this conclusion. The reason why Africa is struggling with all these matters I've raised today in my debate, it's because all these are foreign to the continent of Africa. Why do I say they are foreign? It's because they did not just originate from the continent of Africa, but rather they were introduced at a particular time. Allow me to state today on these factors what has caused democracy to fail in many countries. When you look at the corruption index, for example, the World Corruption Index will tell you that apart from South America, you will find that Africa is considered as one of the highest in terms of corruption. One of the countries in Africa known for corruption worldwide or named for corruption worldwide has been the nation of Nigeria, which is just about 61 years of independence. Worldwide over, they'll say Nigeria is the most corrupt country. But the question must be asked, is Nigeria really corrupt? Or what has caused corruption in Nigeria? Many countries, they will mention South Africa to be one of the corrupt countries in Africa. But what has caused South Africa then to be corrupt, despite of it being a constitutional democracy? When it comes to poverty, some of the most poor countries that will be mentioned on the index chart will be countries like Malawi, countries like Central African Republic, countries like Madagascar, referring them to Africa. And we discover that despite Africa being also endowed with so much natural resource, as we all know, despite of the African people being one of the most hardworking peoples on the earth, we still find poverty, disease, corruption being mentioned to be at rampant in the continent of Africa. Then a question must be asked and say, how will we then overcome these challenges that we face? That is the reason why I present to the great thinkers and the great minds of our great continent of Africa to say, there is need of introspection of all the sons of Africa. Therefore, let us look at the model of governance where we have gone wrong. Because when we look at governance, I define governance as the administration and equitable distribution of natural resource and wealth of its country or its land. The administration and equitable distribution of wealth or resource to its people. For this reason, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a philosophical thought which I have for years developed called Africacy. What is Africacy? Africacy is the governance of the Africans for the Africans and by the Africans. Africacy is the governance of Africans for the Africans by Africans. How do I mean? This is the only solution that can counterattack democracy. Somebody asked me to say, can you define democracy? Of course, the social scientists will tell you democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But when you ask me today, after traveling throughout the continent, and you ask me about what is democracy, I will say to you emphatically, saying democracy is demon craftiness. Let me say it this way. Democracy is demon craftiness. Why do I say demon craftiness? It's because democracy was not crafted or designed in Africa. History tells us the foundation of democracy being somewhere up there in Greece. But when we look at the Western worlds that injected democracy unto us or Europe, you will appreciate scientifically and philosophically to say, before the West democratized, they developed. Before the West democratized, they developed. For a very long time, women were never allowed to vote in the Senate. For a very long time, women were not given opportunities to own. Not just women, but also for a very long time, England was governed by the Queen. The administrative power before it was given to the Prime Minister. But we also see the coexistence of the monarch with the political government of the United Kingdom, if I have to give you that example. They have not ripped off the powers of the monarch. The monarch still carries its sovereignty when you look at England, for example. But for us as Africa, one of the things that we need to deal with and one of the things that we need to look at in this presentation today is that many African countries were colonized. And when they were colonized, we also look at how Africa was colonized. The other part was colonized by Belgium, France, and today we call them the Francophone countries. Fewer countries were colonized by Portugal, and they are called Portuguese countries. Then we've got the other countries that were colonized by England and Germany, and today are called Anglophone. So we've got the Francophone, we've got the Anglophones. And we discover that when all these countries were colonized, the type of governance system that was injected into that particular protectorate, whether be it a British protectorate or be it a British colony, we discover that the governance system was coming straight from where it was colonized, hence influencing the behavior of the people on how the African people view governance. For the Francophone countries, they will view it from the Francophone aspect. The Anglophone will view it from the Anglophone aspect. But I want us to realize that before we dwell so much on the Anglophone, the Francophone, before we dwell so much, we have to ask ourselves, why was there colonization? We should ask ourselves, why was there colonization? You remember in history, we looked at the scramble for Africa. What were they scrambling for? If Africa was a dark continent, if Africa was a bush, if Africa had no potential, if Africa was infested with so much disease. Remember, there was a time that the explorers, when they were exploring into Africa, they were dying, but they never gave up exploring Africa. What were they exploring? They were not exploring the potential of the African people. They were not exploring on how they can develop the African people. They were exploring the wealth of Africa. Because governance, it's all about wealth distribution. And so they wanted to find a way on how they can control the natural resource that has been endowed in the continent of Africa. They knew, Belgium knew, that if it controls the Congos, it would have controlled the gold, the platinums, the uranium, the emeralds, the diamonds. Belgium and France, they knew. So they could not leave the Congo. So how do you do? Let's introduce a model of governance which is foreign to the Congolese, so that as the Congolese begins to focus on politics, we are able to take advantage of the mineral resource and the mineral wealth. Allow me to say this to us. That is the reason why you find that each country which was colonized, it paid its allegiance to their colonizers. And it is in that country that you find that their colonizers are treated as a superhumans, or their colonizers are treated as superhumans. How do I mean? They did not just bring colonization on governance. They introduced religion as well. They introduced also the way of doing things. They taught us how to dress, how to speak, how to address each other. Why? So that the allegiance remains to our colonizers. That is the reason why I've gone to African countries. I am not being racist, but let me use this statement now. I've been to countries, African countries, where if you walk in with a European, you walk in with a man from Europe, the citizens themselves, they begin to belittle their efforts and they belittle their intelligence and they sacrifice it to the man from Europe. I have moved around the continent. Some of the Europeans that come to Africa, they're just barely farmers, but you find they are given a red carpet to walk on a presidential carpet. Not because this person is intelligent or not, but because he's coming from a country that colonized us. I remember we wanted to buy some minerals somewhere. And as I was trying to discuss and negotiate with this person who owned the mines, he was very clear to me and he says, "Doc, can you bring for us some investors?" I said, "No problem. I've got great investors." And then at the end of the line, he said, "When we are dealing in business, we prefer whites." I asked myself a question, why you prefer whites? Does the dollar, when the dollar is in the hands of the white man and the dollar in the hands of the black man, is it different? He says, "No, because whites, they know how to do business." It's not true. It's how corrupted our minds has been. So when we look at the issues of governance, most of the countries in Africa has not looked into ourselves, but rather we have focused and we have looked into those that colonized us, and we still believe that their way of governance is better than us. And I stand to differ and argue. That is the reason why we are proposing Africacy for Africa. The governance of the Africans for the Africans and by the Africans. In other words, let us look into the African system of governance before colonialism. That is what will help us. As I speak on that, let me give you historically when it comes to development. The pyramids of Egypt were developed before the Twin Towers of America were built. The university in Morocco was developed before the universities in Italy. Our traditional councils of KwaZulu-Natal and the Zulu Nation was developed before the British Parliament was established. So the question is, how did we govern ourselves? In the African governance systems, for example, among the Nguni people have existed for over 500 years. Historically, when the migration started just about 230 years, we see the Nguni people distributing themselves into the whole regions, coming from up the northern part of Africa, coming down to southern part of Africa, then starting to go up again to the northern part of Africa. So the Nguni people did not just exist in southern Africa, but rather the Nguni nation exists coming from up the northern part of Africa, getting down into Africa, starting to go up again. But how did they govern themselves? Firstly, the African people had a word that is known as Ubuntu. And so Ubuntu, that's where we bring the word called the Bantu speaking people. If I look at the history of the Bantu speaking people, the word Bantu Today it can be called Bantu because of our colonization. The word Bantu, it does not just mean the word Bantu, it means Bantu, Bantu, Bantu. The Bantu people, therefore, these are people who believed in communism. What do I mean? You are because I am. They believed in living together. They believed in distributing their resources equitably. They believed no child in the village should go to bed hungry. In Tanzania, there is a word that is known called ujamaa. They believed in working in the farms together, developing, building their houses together. I was in Namibia not too long ago among the Bushmen people, and I found that the Bushmen people of Namibia, who some of them are still distributed in the Namibia desert, they still build houses together. They do not wait for government to come and build houses for them. So what did they do? They put their resources together and they were able to administer those resources equitably together. What did democracy do? When colonization came and when democracy was introduced, they say to us, gather the resources, bring them to us, we administer for you. So they introduced an educational system that does not just empower the citizens to work the land, but a citizen to just administer. Hence, they encouraged poverty. So we see the entrance of poverty in Africa, that it did not come by the Africans. Poverty is artificial for Africans. By the way, before, as we speak on that, when we built in Africa, we did not have fences over our houses. When we built in Africa, we did not have fences. We built our houses, whether be it in four-corner shape or our round houses, the roundavoirs. As they were built around the roundavoirs everywhere, people would gather together, put a fire at the center, and in the evening the men will come together, the women will sit together, beat our drums, dance our songs, rejoice. When it is time to go and hunt, they went as a team. When they had to train a young man into adulthood, they trained him as a team. So a child was not your child, was a child of the community. That is citizenry. So I am giving you how Africa was being governed. Africa was governed by true citizenry, true sonship of the soil. So when you come from a specific community, that community worked together, lived together, traveled together. When the lands are no longer fertile, migration took place. When the land were no longer fertile, migration took place. And how did migration take place? Nobody migrated alone, but they all migrated as a community. When you are migrating, you migrated as a community. You say, we are moving from here because our beans cannot grow anymore. Our soils cannot grow anymore. So we never built fences. Where did the fences come from? These all came from knowing that we were colonized, and when we were colonized, in the same sense that the colonial masters began to build what they call protectorates. And they said this part is Portuguese protectorate. This one is Belgium Protectorate. This one is the British Protectorate. As they were building that, they introduced what is known as boundaries or borders. So do you see how borders were being developed? When you look at the continent of Africa, you will discover that they, on its own, it is borderless. But where did the borders come from? It came from as they scrambled for economic power and resource. But we ourselves, as the African people, historically, we have lived in harmony and at peace with everybody. For example, let me give you this example. I have traveled everywhere and I see some countries fight the One Africa agenda. Why do they fight the One Africa agenda? It's because we have been so colonized that we build fences around us. Do you know why they built fences? When these Europeans came, they knew that they were stocking our natural resources. They knew they were stocking the gold. They're stocking the diamonds. They're stocking all the minerals, the wealth of the country. So they had to protect themselves from the citizens. But our traditional leaders, as our chiefs, had nothing to protect because a king was equal to his people. A king was made by his people. A king was, the pride of the king was in his people. So they lived in harmony. So you will be traveling. And I remember this even in my growing up in the years in the village. You will be traveling at night on foot from one place to another. And when it is late at night, you will stop over at any house. And you will knock at that house and say, knock here. And they will open for you. And when they open for you, they will say to you, come in, sir. Come in, madam. Where are you coming from? And where are you going? It is late now. You cannot proceed. They will prepare a bed for you. They will prepare water for you to bath. They will prepare a meal for you. You will sleep there until the following day without them knowing exactly who you are. Why? Because migration was part of the lives of the African people. But beyond that, they also knew, the African people, they knew that we are one people. There is a word that I said at the beginning called Bantu. Bantu. That's why you find this word everywhere in the continent of Africa. Others, they call it Bantu. Today, a philosophy is formed called Ubuntu. What is Ubuntu? Ubuntu simply means umuntu ngomuntu ngabantu. You are because I am. There was no need of corruption. We were not scared of each other. Why? Because we knew that the person that has come, he is my brother. She is my sister. And so we can build together. Hence, the governance system of Africa has been polluted, corrupted, not because we, the African people, cannot govern ourselves, but because democracy is a foreign system to us as the African people. Democracy makes you to be an enemy with your mother-in-law if she belongs to another party. Democracy makes you feel insecure. Democracy entrusts the wealth of your nation to a few elite to administer it. As they try all the best to administer that wealth, it ends up only to benefit their families, their colleagues, and their cronies, and also their masters. I will continue to debate on this discussion of Africacy in the next episode.